We're speaking today with John Ellsworth of Success Strategies. Welcome, John, again. Happy to have our monthly conversation.
We're good. Thank you, Joel. Good to be here.
And a topic today that you wanted to speak about was the headline was KPIs and your profitability. And your KPI is a key performance indicator. And that's a different sort of thing. That's a herd and dairy farm performance indicator rather than a financial measure. So talk a little bit about the accounting aspect, and then let's talk a little bit about the KPIs that you've identified.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Joel. Well, I think the most important thing is that it's important to remember that the key performance indicators are the building blocks for that final score, if you will, and the final score is in the accounting. The accounting is a recording of what's already happened, a summarization of what's already happened on a performance standpoint. The KPIs are the driving factors for those results, whether they're positive or negative financial results. KPI, when I talk about KPIs, I'm talking about things like days in milk in a herd, a dairy herd, pregnancy rate, calf mortality is a big one, I think, because the last 4 years, in my clientele anyway, some of the most profitable dairies, or those with the smallest losses, if you will, but in some cases they were actually very profitable, came from, part of their revenue stream came from selling excess animals. And those, granted, were not at a high price as they used to be. They weren't $2,000 per head. Maybe they were only $1,300 or $1,400, but it provided some cash inflows that other people didn't have. And that made them more profitable, made them more sound in terms of cash flow. So, but I think some of these key performance indicators are just crucial for people to watch. And the nice thing is, you don't necessarily have to compare with other operations. You can compare with your own operation. How many 2-year-olds did I have that I could sell excess in 2019 versus 18 versus 2017, and so on. And so you're really just competing against yourself, but I think it can make a very positive difference on your bottom line numbers. And things like, as I said earlier, the days in milk, that is really driven by the pregnancy rate and the heat detection rate, which are key performance things. If you ever go into a dairy that's having financial problems, and I've done a lot of those turnarounds over the last 20 years at Success Strategies, what typically I find, not always, but typically it's very common to find breeding problems. So as a result, the pregnancy rate is low, the number of fresh cows is low, so the days in milk become higher and higher. When we get over that 160 to 170 days, that's a key performance indicator that should be like flashing red light that says, oh my gosh, we've got some problems here. And the result is a weaker cash flow and poorer debt service coverage, things like that, which are an accounting measurement that summarizes what did or didn't happen, previously on the key performance areas. So hopefully that helps.
The accounting reports that a dairyman would receive for his business, obviously there's a tax return application there, but the accounting reports are like, maybe using an athletic analogy, if I am understanding you, the accounting reports are like the scoreboard, whereas your key performance indicators are what's going on in the game or on the field. And
yes,
and that's where you affect the scoreboard, but it's how you're playing the game, if you will.
Exactly. It's a good analogy. It's a great analogy. Actually, the accounting is like the final score. It's what happened. Did you get 9 runs or did you get 1 run and the opposing team got 7? That's the final score, but it's the hitting, the base stealing, and all those things that happen in the 9 innings before that. Those are the key performance indicators. So in the case of a baseball player, maybe it's his batting average. Well, if he's batting 175, his key performance indicator isn't looking real shiny as opposed to 375. And so that's probably a great analogy to look at, yes.
Coming back to KPIs that we're talking about in this conversation, days in milk and pregnancy rate. Just say again what your indicators are that if you achieve a certain level or above, you'll probably be doing okay.
Okay. Well, I think, and everybody will have different opinions on this. These are real general, broad strokes, if you will. But I find like if you take a look at days in milk, I think that's a big one. That's driven by the breeding program, of course. If you're not getting pregnancies, you don't get fresh cows, and your days in milk will certainly trend upward. But what I'm seeing, the most profitable operations that I work with, what I'm seeing is not only days in milk in that 160 to no more than 170 days in milk at any given time, but just as significantly, I'm finding that it's important that they stay consistently in that 160 to 170 day range on days in milk throughout the whole year. Because you can say, I averaged 168 days in milk for the whole year, but if some of the time you're at 150 days and some of the time you're at 210 days, that's not going to work out for those months very well for those months where you are at 210, because your milk flow is going to be low. And if it's combined with heat stress and things like that, you're gonna really damage your cash flow. So days in milk is big. I think pregnancy rate, we used to say if you could be in the low to mid 20s, you were doing pretty well, and maybe you are. But I'm seeing the real achievers are now looking at, heck, I don't want to be at 24% preg rate. I want to be at 30%. And my best, most profitable operations right now are running in that 28 to 32% preg rate, which is pretty phenomenal by historical standards. The heat detection, of course, drives that too. If you're not running 65% heat detection rate, it's hard to catch those cows and get them bred back. So that's big. The other thing we talked about earlier was calf mortality. From the perspective of, being able to sell excess dairy cattle at 2 years or close to 2 years, it's hard to sell them if they're dead. I mean, if they don't survive, you obviously can't keep them in the herd, keep them alive. And then you have some thinking of people saying, well, but it's costing me on the cash flow side because I got too many heifers. Well, I didn't say you had to keep them all, but it's nice to have the choice of which, the best genetics to keep in your herd, which will impact your future herd performance very positively. But you can also you can market the excess ones even at a younger age. And with the genetic testing that's out there that's available, I have some clients that do that every month on every heifer. And they're keeping what they believe to be the most positive genetic influence animals in their herd. And they're marketing the rest of them, even at some young ages, and not raising them. But again, if you can't keep them alive, you don't get the option to select the best genetics necessarily. So the calf mortality, keeping the very best alive, is essential and crucial, of course. The other thing, I think these are key performance indicators that you don't see a lot on this, but I think we're seeing more and more. And that is efficiency measures like cows per hour through the barn. How many pounds of milk are we shipping? I know you mentioned earlier that Cornell University has done some great work in this area. To be honest with you, in the operations that I work with, they're fairly large operations, but if we're not at 100 employees, I'm sorry, not 100 employees, I said it backwards, sorry. If we're not at 100 cows per employee, then we aren't maximizing our efficiency. And that's just a general number, but the operations that have 100 to 200 cows per employee, I'm finding those really have the best efficiencies. And sometimes it's tied to facility as well.
Just to kind of finish up here, John, particularly for a couple of these KPIs, performance indicators, is that kind of a monthly evaluation that the herd owner, herd manager should dig into on a monthly basis, or what's the frequency that those numbers ought to be looked at?
Well, I think you got to watch the trends, and the only way to watch the trend, those are typically in dairy comp and the DHI programs, those are typically a rolling 12, 13-month average. So but you can start spotting the trends. If you've been running 62% heat detection rate, for example, and suddenly you have a couple months where you're in the high 40s, that should be a red flag. So I like to watch them every month. And it doesn't take that long. With these programs, if you're inputting your herd management information to Dairy Comp or some of the DHI programs, and there's probably other programs out there that I don't even have access to or use. But I think if you're inputting the right information, I like to monitor those things monthly. I think that's often enough, but it's the input of information that gets us there. But it's the management team meetings that I do with clients. We're talking about those things every month, and we want to know what the trends are and what we expect the trend will be going forward. Hopefully, in most cases, that if our pregnancy rate is, say, it's only 22%, and our objective is to get to 27, we can sort of predict what's going on or make some managerial changes, because the more often you measure it, the closer control you have over it, and the more likely you are to make improvements. So I appreciate the fact that we look at those things every month, because it's just everything in the dairy industry is getting so intense the last 4 years for profitability that the sooner we catch those things, if there's a problem, of course, the sooner we can get them corrected and get moving forward.
Sure. Well, John, thank you for talking about KPIs and how they compare to accounting and financial numbers. We appreciate that. I want to alert our folks that you can be reached at your website, success-strategies.com. And again, we're speaking with John Ellsworth, and this is Joel Hastings for DairyBusiness.com.